She stays. Mr. Seomun, with respect, this woman has no standing in. She stays. The voice never rose. It didn't need to. That was the moment Chante Farmer understood she had been wrong about everything. About the meeting, about the test, about the 7 years she thought she had spent becoming invisible, about the quiet Korean man who had watched her from across a boardroom table for 14 months and never once let her see him watching. Sun-Cho had built his power in that company the way men like him always do, by deciding who belonged and who didn't, who got to speak and who got shown the door. For 3 years, Chante had kept the executive floor running on a support contract that gave her no standing, no protection, and no seat at any table that mattered. She learned the names of their children. She fixed their schedules. She was furniture. Then, one afternoon, in a glass-walled conference room on the 9th floor of a gaming studio in Seomyeon, Yoon Sun-cho told her to leave a meeting where she was the only person who knew what had gone wrong. And the heir to a shipping syndicate, a man 7 years younger than her, a man she had dismissed as cold and unreadable, a man with a bullet lodged near his spine that he had never mentioned to anyone, said 2 words that sat every person in that boardroom down like someone had cut their strings. What does it cost a woman to be truly seen by someone who was never supposed to notice her? Stay with this one, because that boardroom is only the beginning. What Chante discovers next, about the test she never knew she was taking, about the man who engineered it, about the outbreak she contained before anyone understood it was deliberate, will rewrite everything you think you know about who holds the power in this story. And I promise you, it does not end the way you think it will. This is the story of a woman who was treated like furniture in a room full of powerful men. A woman who walked away from epidemiology and outbreak response to become someone no one looked at twice, because some parts of her old life became too heavy to carry. A woman who found herself 6,000 miles from a cramped efficiency apartment in rural South Georgia, standing in a Busan high-rise, being told to leave. She didn't leave. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew exactly what you were worth, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your story. 14 months earlier. The elevator opened onto the 9th floor at 7:42 a.m., and Chante Farmer stepped out carrying 2 boxes of replacement toner cartridges, a laptop bag that wasn't hers, and the quiet certainty that no one on this floor would remember her name by lunch. She was 32 years old, 5 feet 9 inches tall, without the low heels she wore to client sites, and she had been in Busan for 11 months. The support contract paid 2.4 million won a month, which covered her studio apartment in Nampodong and left enough for the occasional imported peanut butter that reminded her of the efficiency she'd left behind in rural South Georgia, the one across from the public housing courtyard where she'd learned to double dutch on cracked asphalt. The gaming studio took up the entire floor, glass walls sectioned off conference rooms from open workstations. Someone had installed a foosball table near the break room that no one ever used. The carpet smelled faintly of new construction and stale coffee. She set the toner cartridges on the supply room shelf, logged the delivery in the inventory system, and checked the morning's ticket queue. 3 password resets. A jammed printer on the east side. A calendar sync issue for someone in marketing who had marked the request as urgent and then gone on vacation. By 8:15, she had cleared the queue. By 8:30, she had noticed that the executive conference room's AV system was throwing an error code no one had reported. By 8:47, she had fixed it, documented the solution, and left before anyone could ask who she was. That was the job. Arrive early, fix things before they broke. Leave no trace except functioning systems. The contract company that employed her, a Korean staffing firm that specialized in bilingual IT support, had placed her here after her previous assignment ended. The gaming studio's parent company was a subsidiary of something larger, something with interest in shipping and logistics and industries Chante had learned not to ask about. She had stopped asking about a lot of things when she left Atlanta. The morning passed the way mornings always passed. She moved through the floor like someone who had been given permission to exist, but not to be noticed. The developers nodded at her occasionally. The project managers copied her on emails about system access without ever addressing her directly. The executives on the south side of the floor, the ones with the private offices and the views of the harbor, never looked at her at all. Yoon Sun-cho was one of those executives. She had learned his name in her first week. Senior board member. Ran the company's daily operations. Had been with the parent company for 23 years, since before the gaming studio existed. Since before the shipping interest had expanded into whatever they had become. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and he moved through the floor like a man who had decided long ago that certain people were furniture and had never been given a reason to reconsider. Chante had watched him dismiss 3 different support contractors before her. One for being too slow, one for being too visible, one for looking him in the eye when he was speaking to someone else. She had no intention of being the 4th, so she kept her head down. She fixed the systems. She learned which conference rooms had the temperamental projectors and which executives needed their laptops rebooted every Tuesday because they refused to close their browser tabs. She became the person you called when something stopped working and you needed it working again in less time than it would take to file a formal IT request. And she never, not once, let Yoon Sun-cho learn her name. It was a sustainable arrangement. It was a safe one. She could do this for years, she told herself, collecting the modest paycheck, renewing the contract every 6 months, disappearing into the machinery of a company that would never see her as anything more than a line item in the operations budget. Then Haechul Seomun walked into the conference room during her 11:30 printer repair, and the arrangement stopped being sustainable. She didn't know who he was at first. He was young. Late 20s at most, though something about the way he carried himself made the estimate feel unreliable. He wore a dark gray suit that fit him precisely, no tie, and he moved with the careful economy of someone conserving energy for something more important than walking across a conference room. She was under the table, replacing a jammed feeder tray in the printer that lived in the corner of the room, when his shoes appeared in her peripheral vision. Italian leather. Black. Recently polished, but not new. She kept working. The quarterly projections are in the shared drive, someone was saying. A project manager named Kwan, nervous, eager to please. Mr. Seomun, if you'd like me to pull them up on the main screen. I've read them. His voice was quiet, not soft, not gentle. Quiet in the way that a room full of louder voices goes still to hear. Chante finished the repair. She slid out from under the table, stood, brushed off her knees, and gathered her tools. The professional thing to do was leave. The room was filling with executives now, men in expensive suits arranging themselves around the long table, and she had no standing here. She was support. She was furniture. She turned toward the door and found him looking at her. Not past her. Not through her. At her. Haechul Seomun was 25 years old, though she wouldn't learn that for weeks. He was the heir apparent to the shipping syndicate his father had built from a single dock crew, the one that owned the holding company that owned the subsidiary that owned this gaming studio on the 9th floor in Seomyeon. He had a bullet lodged near his spine from an assassination attempt at 19, inoperable, and he lived with pain he managed through a discipline everyone around him mistook for coldness. She knew none of this. She knew only that he was looking at her, and that his gaze had a quality she couldn't name, not predatory, not dismissive, something else. Something that felt like being weighed on a scale she didn't know existed. The printer is fixed, she said, because someone had to say something. He nodded once, a small motion, precise. She left. In the hallway outside, she stood for 3 feet from the door for 11 seconds, her tool bag in her hand, her pulse doing something it had no business doing. She had not felt whatever that was in a long time. She had not wanted to feel it. She had come to Busan to disappear, not to be seen. She went back to the supply room and filed the repair ticket as complete. The rest of the day passed without incident.
She did not see Haechul Seomun again. She did not expect to. Men like that, men who owned the buildings other people worked in, did not notice the contractors who kept the printers running. The moment in the conference room had been an anomaly. A brief lapse in the natural order. It would not happen again. It happened again. 3 days later, he was in the break room when she came in to refill the paper towel dispenser. He was standing by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the harbor. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself slightly off-center, favoring his left side. Pain, she thought, though she didn't know why she thought it. Something in the way he breathed. She replaced the paper towels. She didn't speak. "You fixed the east side projector yesterday," he said, without turning around. "Yes." The facilities report said it was a hardware failure, that the unit would need to be replaced. The facilities report was wrong. He turned then. The morning light from the harbor caught the angles of his face, and she noticed for the first time that he was handsome in a severe way, all clean lines and careful stillness. "You contradicted the report?" "I fixed the projector. The report can say whatever it wants." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not quite. A slight softening around the eyes that might have been amusement, or might have been something else entirely. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Names had power in places like this. Names got you noticed. Names got you remembered by men like Yun-Sun Cho, who decided who belonged and who didn't. "Chante Farmer," she said anyway. He nodded again. That same small, precise motion. "Miss Farmer." And then he was gone, moving past her toward the door, and she was standing alone in the break room with a roll of paper towels in her hand and the distinct feeling that something had just begun that she wasn't prepared for. The weeks that followed were strange. She continued her work. She fixed the systems, cleared the tickets, arrived early and left late. But now, sometimes, she would look up from a repair and find him across the room, in a meeting that had spilled into the hallway, walking toward his father's office on the south side of the floor, standing by the elevators, waiting, his posture careful and controlled. He never approached her again. He never spoke to her again. But he watched. She told herself it meant nothing. Men in power watched things. It was what they did. They surveyed their territory, cataloged their assets, kept track of the moving pieces. She was a moving piece. She was not special. But something in the way he looked at her said otherwise. Yun-Sun Cho, meanwhile, had begun to notice her too. Not the way Haechul Seomun noticed her. Cho noticed her the way a man notices a piece of furniture that has been moved slightly out of place. She had become too visible, too present. She fixed things too quickly, too competently, and the executives had started asking for her by name. "The American woman," they would say to her manager, "the tall one. She fixed my laptop in 15 minutes last week. Send her again." Cho did not like this. She could feel his displeasure in the small ways he made her job harder. The suddenly restricted access to certain conference rooms. The formal complaints about support staff being present in executive spaces without prior approval. The way he would enter a room she was working in and simply stand there, watching until she finished and left. He never spoke to her directly. That would have been beneath him. But he made his position clear. She was tolerated, not accepted. She existed at his sufferance, and he could revoke that sufferance at any time. She kept her head down. She did her job. She avoided him when she could and endured him when she couldn't. But she started keeping notes. The inconsistencies in the facilities reports. The equipment failures that happened too often in the same locations. The way certain meetings were scheduled at the last minute when the usual support staff wouldn't be available. Small things. Things that might mean nothing. Things that might mean something. She had learned to notice patterns in her old life, the ones she didn't talk about anymore.
Epidemiology was all patterns. Outbreak response was all reading the data others missed, connecting the dots others couldn't see. She had walked away from that work when the weight of it became too much, when the things she'd seen in the field started following her home. But the training never left. The instinct never dulled. Something was wrong on the 9th floor. She didn't know what yet, but she was watching. And somewhere across the open-plan workspace, behind the glass walls of his borrowed office, Haechul Seomun was watching too. She wouldn't learn until much later that he had been watching her for 14 months by the time Sun-Cho finally ordered her out of that boardroom meeting, that he had engineered situations to see how she would respond, that the projector failure, the calendar syncing issues, the password resets that required her to be in certain places at certain times had all been tests. She wouldn't learn that he had read her file, that he knew about the efficiency apartment in South Georgia, that he knew about the epidemiology work she'd abandoned, the outbreak response she'd walked away from, that he knew things about her that she had spent years trying to forget. She wouldn't learn that the bullet near his spine ached every time the weather changed, and that he had stood at his window on 3 separate occasions, watching her cross the parking lot in the rain, and thought about what it would mean to be seen by someone who might understand pain without needing it explained. All of that came later. For now, there was only the work, the support tickets, the quiet competence of a woman who had learned to make herself useful without making herself visible, and the slow, inexorable collision course with a man who had decided, for reasons he kept to himself, that she was worth watching. Haechul Seomun finished his coffee. He set the cup down on his desk. The pain in his back was worse today, a low thrum that radiated down his left leg, but he had learned to move through it. He had been moving through it for 6 years. Across the floor, through 2 walls of glass and the maze of workstations between them, he could see her, Chante Farmer. 32 years old, former CDC epidemiologist with a specialty in outbreak response. Current support contractor with no standing, no protection, and no idea that the man watching her had already decided she was the most interesting person in the building. He watched her fix a jammed printer with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. And he waited. The pattern started with the coffee machine. 4 weeks after that first encounter in the break room, the executive floor's espresso system began failing at irregular intervals. Not consistently enough to justify replacement, not predictably enough to diagnose remotely. Someone had to be present when it happened. Someone had to observe the failure in real time. Chante was called to the break room 7 times in 11 days. On the 3rd call, Haechul Seomun was there. On the 5th, on the 7th. Always with the same cup in his hand, the same careful posture, the same quality of attention that felt like being measured against a standard she couldn't see. The heating element cycles incorrectly, she told him on the 5th visit, her tools spread across the counter. Someone adjusted the thermostat settings manually, repeatedly. You think it's deliberate? I think someone keeps changing the settings back after I fix them. He said nothing. But something in his expression shifted, the way light shifts behind glass when the angle changes. She finished the repair, she left. She did not ask why he was always there when the machine failed. The calendar conflicts came next. 3 separate executives found themselves double-booked for the same conference room on the same afternoon, a scheduling error that should have been impossible given the booking system's conflict detection. Chante spent 4 hours tracing the problem to a permissions change that had been made from an administrative account, not a user error. Someone with system access had deliberately created the conflict. She documented everything. She did not report it. On the day of the scheduling disaster, while she was explaining the error to the frustrated executives, Haechul Seomun walked past the conference room. He did not stop. He did not look in. But his pace slowed, almost imperceptibly, as he passed the doorway. She noticed. The projector on the east side failed again. The same projector on the east side failed again. The same projector she had fixed twice before. The same error code.
the same impossible malfunction in a system that had no mechanical reason to keep breaking. She was kneeling behind the unit, her diagnostic tablet in hand, when the pattern finally clicked. Not a pattern of failure, a pattern of placement. Every malfunction had put her in a specific location at a specific time. The coffee machine failures had placed her in the break room during Haechul Seomun's irregular morning visits. The calendar conflicts had required her presence in the executive conference room for hours, visible to anyone passing. The projector had positioned her on the east side of the floor, directly in the sightline of the borrowed office where he worked when he was on site. She sat back on her heels. The tablet screen glowed in the dim space behind the projector mount. Someone had been moving her around the floor like a piece on a board. Someone with administrative access. Someone who wanted to see how she would respond to problems that had no natural explanation. The realization settled into her chest like ice water. She finished the repair. She documented it. She left the conference room and walked directly to the supply closet where the network logs were archived on a backup server that most people had forgotten existed. It took her 40 minutes to find the access records. Every administrative change, every permissions modification, every deliberate introduction of chaos into the building systems over the past 14 months traced back to the same source. A user account with no name attached. An account that had been created 6 years ago, during a system overhaul that coincided with the assassination attempt that had nearly killed the heir to the Seomun shipping syndicate. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she closed the logs, locked the server room, and went back to work. The company event was scheduled for the following Thursday. A quarterly celebration for the gaming studio staff, catered, held in the large conference space on the 9th floor. Chante was not invited. Support contractors were never invited, but she was expected to be on site for technical support, invisible in the corners, ready to fix any AV failures or network issues that might interrupt the festivities. She arrived at 5:30 p.m., an hour before the event was scheduled to begin. The caterers were already setting up. Long tables covered in white cloth, chafing dishes warming over small flames. The smell of grilled meat and fermented vegetables filled the floor. She checked the presentation system. She tested the microphones. She made sure the backup projector was ready in case the primary failed. And she watched. The pattern she had noticed in the building systems, she saw it now in the food service too, small inconsistencies. A caterer who moved differently than the others, whose hands were too careful, whose attention kept drifting to a specific chafing dish near the center of the buffet line. She had spent 3 years at the CDC learning to recognize contamination vectors. She had walked through outbreak zones where the difference between a natural cluster and a deliberate introduction was a matter of distribution patterns and timing. This was not natural. She moved toward the buffet table. The caterer with the careful hands glanced at her and looked away too quickly. "Excuse me," Chante said. "I need to check the temperature on these warming units. Facilities request." She had no such request. But the lie came easily, the professional authority she had spent years cultivating settling over her like a second skin. She checked the chafing dishes, one by one, noting temperatures, noting which foods had been touched recently, noting which dishes the careful caterer had been positioned near. The bulgogi in the third dish from the left. The temperature was wrong, not enough to be obvious, but enough to matter. Enough to create conditions where certain bacteria could thrive. She flagged down the catering supervisor. She spoke quietly, professionally, citing food safety protocols she remembered from her old life. The dish was removed. A replacement was brought in. The careful caterer disappeared into the service elevator before anyone could question him. Chante filed no report. She told no one what she had seen. But she stayed near the buffet line for the rest of the setup, and she watched every dish that was served. The event began at 6:30 p.m. By 7:15 p.m., Yoon-sun Cho was standing at the head of the room, making a speech about company values and quarterly performance. Chante stood in the back corner near the emergency exit, invisible. By 7:45 p.m., Haechul Seomun had arrived. He entered through the main doors, flanked by two men she recognized from the security team. His suit was darker than usual, black instead of gray, and he moved with the same careful economy she had noticed in their first encounter, favoring his left side, managing pain that never showed on his face. He did not look at her. He walked directly to Yoon-sun Cho. The speech stopped.
The room went quiet. Something in the quality of that silence told Chante that whatever was about to happen had been planned for a long time. "Mr. Cho," Haechul said. His voice carried without effort. "I have some questions about the facilities reports from the past 14 months. Cho's face did something complicated. A flicker of surprise, quickly controlled. "This is hardly the venue for operational discussions, Mr. Seomun." "I disagree." Haechul turned slightly, addressing the room. "The reports in question document a pattern of equipment failures on this floor. Failures that required the repeated presence of a specific support contractor in specific locations at specific times." Chante felt the ice water in her chest again. "The reports were falsified," Haechul continued, "not by the contractor, by someone with administrative access to our systems, someone who wanted to create the appearance of incompetence, someone who has been, for the past 23 years, using his position to remove anyone who might notice the discrepancies in his operational budgets." Cho's face went pale. "The equipment failures were tests," Haechul said, "designed by my office to observe how the contractor responded to sabotage. She passed. Every time. She identified the deliberate interference, she documented it privately, and she continued to do her job without seeking credit or creating conflict." He paused. The room was absolutely still. "Tonight, she identified a contamination in the catering. Someone had introduced bacteria into one of the dishes. Someone who was paid to do so by an individual who wanted this event to become a health crisis that could be blamed on operational negligence." Cho took a step backward. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "I have documentation," Haechul said quietly. "Financial records. Communication logs. A pattern of embezzlement and sabotage spanning more than a decade. The authorities have been notified. But before they arrive, I wanted you to understand something." He turned then, finally, and looked at Chante. The room turned with him. She stood in the back corner, near the emergency exit, her tool bag in her hand. 6,000 miles from the efficiency apartment in rural South Georgia, where she had learned to be invisible. She was 32 years old. She had been watched for 14 months by a man who had engineered tests she never knew she was taking, and she was furious. "Miss Farmer," Haechul said, "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me more than that." Her voice came out steady, controlled. The room had gone even more silent, if that was possible. "You tested me," she said, "for over a year. You broke systems so you could watch me fix them. You created problems so you could see how I handled them. You used me." "Yes." No excuse. No justification. Just acknowledgement. "The syndicate requires absolute certainty in the people it trusts," he said. "My father's organization has been betrayed before. The bullet in my spine is a reminder of what that costs. I needed to know who you were before I could act on what I saw." "And what did you see?" "Someone who solves problems instead of creating them. Someone who notices what others miss. Someone who has the skills to identify sabotage and the integrity to handle it quietly, without seeking leverage or advantage." He paused. "Someone I could not stop watching." Cho chose that moment to move. He stepped toward the side door, trying to slip away while attention was elsewhere. 2 security officers blocked his path. "Let him go." The words came from Chante. The room turned again. "Miss Farmer," Haechul said carefully. "I said, let him go."
She stepped forward, out of her corner, into the center of the room. You have your documentation. You've notified the authorities. The process will handle him. But this? She gestured at the room, at the frozen executives, at the spectacle of a man being destroyed in front of his colleagues. This is theater. This is you demonstrating power, and I will not be the prop you use to do it. Something shifted in Haechul's expression. That same softening around the eyes she had noticed in the break room 14 months ago. What would you have me do? Let the evidence speak for itself. Let the investigation proceed through proper channels. Let him face consequences that come from the law, not from your family's ability to make problems disappear. She met his gaze directly. I didn't come to Korea to be rescued. I didn't spend 3 years becoming invisible so that someone could pull me out and use me as a demonstration of what happens to people who cross the Seomun syndicate. Cho was staring at her. Everyone was staring at her. I want to be seen, she said, but not like this, not as a weapon. If you want me to trust you, if you want whatever this is to be real, then it has to be earned. Through respect, through honesty. Through treating me like a person instead of a piece in a game I didn't know I was playing. The silence stretched. Then Haechul Seomun nodded once, that small, precise motion she had come to recognize. Security will escort Mr. Cho to the lobby, he said. The authorities will take custody when they arrive. The investigation will proceed according to law. He turned back to Chante. And I will explain everything. Not here. Not as a performance. But somewhere private where you can ask any question you need to ask and I will answer honestly. That's a start. She did not smile. Neither did he. But something had shifted between them. Something that felt like the beginning of a conversation that would take a long time to finish. Yoon Sun Cho was escorted from the room. The executives began murmuring to each other, processing what they had witnessed. The caterers quietly resumed serving food that had been tested and cleared. And Chante Farmer stood in the center of the 9th floor, no longer invisible, no longer furniture, watching a man with a bullet near his spine walk toward her with the careful gait of someone who had decided, after 14 months of watching, that she was worth the risk of being seen in return. 3 weeks later, the rain came to Busan. Chante stood at the window of Haechul's apartment, watching the harbor lights blur through the water streaming down the glass. The space was simpler than she had expected. Clean lines, warm wood, a kitchen that looked like someone actually used it. He was making tea. She could hear him moving behind her, the careful economy of motion she had learned to recognize as pain management rather than coldness. The bullet near his spine ached when the weather changed. He had told her that, finally, in the private conversation he had promised. He had told her a lot of things. "You're thinking too loud," he said. She turned. He was holding 2 cups, steam rising between them. "I'm thinking about the coffee machine," she said. "The one that kept breaking." "Ah." He handed her a cup. His fingers brushed hers, deliberate. "That was the second test. The first was the projector. And if I had failed? You wouldn't have." He sat on the low couch, leaving space for her. "I watched you for 4 weeks before I introduced the first malfunction. I already knew what you would do." "That's not an answer." "No." He looked at her. That quality of attention she had felt in the conference room 14 months ago. "But it's the truth. I knew who you were before I tested you. The tests were for the people around me who needed proof." She sat beside him, not touching but close. The rain against the windows filled the silence. "I spent 3 years becoming invisible," she said, "and you saw me anyway. You were never invisible. You were waiting." "For what?" Or he set his cup down on the low table. He turned toward her, and his hand came up to rest against her jaw. Light. Careful. The gesture of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed. For someone who would ask permission first. She had been seen before, by men who wanted to use what they saw. by systems that reduced her to data points and outcomes, by a world that measured her worth in solved problems and contained outbreaks and the quiet efficiency of a woman who never demanded credit. She had been seen, but she had never been chosen. She had learned that being watched was not the same as being known. She had learned that tests could be a form of respect if the person administering them was willing to accept the answer. She had learned that a man who lived with pain he never mentioned could recognize the weight she carried without needing it explained. She had learned that 6,000 miles was not far enough to outrun the past, but it was exactly far enough to find a future she had not known to want. His thumb traced her cheekbone. She closed her eyes. The rain kept falling. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment and tell me about a time someone finally saw what you had been carrying alone. I would be honored to read it. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications, and I promise the next story will be even harder to walk away from. Thank you for watching until the very end. I will see you in the next one.